Hi everybody, my name is Luis Maya and this is the Behavioral Economics of Global Affairs. This session is being recorded to replace or to substitute for our meeting in a previous week, a meeting that we couldn't have. There was this workshop of economics in the Department of Economics, so we couldn't meet. Therefore, here we are, and we're going to try to record this session to substitute for that meeting. The topic we are going to discuss today is one of the most important ones in our course. Okay, we're going to talk about public policy in the 21st century, and specifically, we're going to talk about policies that try to address a very, very important matter, which is extreme poverty, poverty in the context of a pandemic, and of course, inequality, which is a very important characteristics of our civilization in this 21st century, right? Okay, so first of all, just for starter, we're gonna have to look again at what is going on, right? So we watch the news every day. We know that lots and lots of people have had extreme difficulties to deal with the pandemic. Many people are losing their jobs. They are losing sources of income. And I mean, social exclusion in many countries, it's it's getting tougher. It's getting like a larger problem, and governments all over the world are trying to address these issues and try to compensate somehow with public policy, right? When we look at a picture like this, we recognize Brazil immediately, obviously, but we also are reminded of this conventional way of looking at poverty, right? Over the last 40, 50 years, we have been educated to look at poverty from this perspective that people lack physical capital and they have difficulties to acquire and to accumulate human capital, knowledge, expertise, right? So if you are in this sort of situation, it's very hard to get a good source of income and a sustainable job, something that will actually provide you the money, the income enough to sustain a family, right? So this is basically the fundamental look, the conventional way to look at poverty. We have lack of education, therefore lack of job opportunity. We end up having larger shares of population with low income, not so much uh, money enough to sustain a family need, to somehow support families' necessities. And then we have hunger, we have poor health, poor living conditions, and all of those will impact education, accumulation of human capital, therefore fewer and fewer opportunities, and this becomes a cycle, right? So there's nothing fundamentally wrong with this model, but it turns out that it does not include important aspects of poverty that we are going to try to reveal and to look from a different perspective, right? This is behavior economics, so we are getting closer and closer to this practice of looking at problems from different perspectives, right? This is the whole proposition of this course, right? But then again, in our former week, We kind of recommended that all students had a look at this documentary. I mean, it's not a documentary, but it's almost as if it was, right? This was a film. I shared with you a link to so you could watch I, Daniel Blake. This film was translated in Portuguese. It was available to you in Portuguese, but then again, uh, there was this was a very good piece of material if we want to discuss poverty and public policy from a developed country. So we're going to start from this perspective, right? We're talking about a British citizen. So he lives in London or nearby London. So it's a relatively rich, one of the most developed cities in the world. And we're going to talk a little bit about what we saw in that film. But let's stop right here and think back about the things that we have discussed so far. First, we have discussed behavior from an individual perspective. What is that supposed to mean? Well, we consider rationality and bounded rationality specifically, which means people are not always that rational. They don't always behave as they could, and many times they don't have time enough to make decisions. They don't make the best decisions possible, and so on. We also looked at prospect theory, which means uh, a theory that is supposed to substitute for this conventional model of rationality. So we understood how people actually make choices when they observe risks, right? When they are dealing with uncertainty. And then we talked about loss aversion. We talk about lots of those issues, right? We also talk about satisficing. It's more related to bounded rationality than prospect theory, but it's okay that we have to mention that. Satisficing here is a term in opposition to maximizing, right? From the conventional rational behavior, we would have people trying to maximize their choices, the result of their choices, and making choices in order to maximize their satisfaction, their gains. And satisficing goes all the other way to say, well, people do not actually optimize. What they do is that they look for options that are good enough. After all, they don't have all the time in the world to make choices, right? So uh, we were trying to revise individual behavior. So we talked also about cognitive biases. Sorry. We talked about cognitive biases. We talked about heuristics, persuasion, all of those personal or individual aspects of choices, right? Then we also talked about organizational behavior. We talked a little bit about sustainable business, the rise of sustainable business. We discussed unethical or ethical behavior in organizations. And we actually talked about the organizational dynamics in complex contexts, right? When we had um, to discuss, for example, budget, sometimes people participate, sometimes they don't. People's preferences change over time, and all those difficulties we have in order to make decisions in an organization. And finally, we have like social behavior, and then we talked about shared knowledge, we talked about peer pressure, discrimination, prejudice, we also discussed those. And I would like to remind all of you about social learning theory, which is something that we discussed before, but deals with the fact that people make decisions and sometimes they do believe they are able to make very good options. They do believe that they can acquire new behaviors. And sometimes they don't. They just don't think that they will be capable of solving problems or dealing with difficulties. So, how sure you are about your own capacity to solve a problem, that's what we call self-efficacy, right? But then we also have social efficacy, which in Brazil is mostly related to that phrase, uma andorinha só não faz verão, right? I mean, it's hard to solve a problem when you are the only one trying to do it. If you feel like, for example, we have the dengue mosquitoes, we have to take care of water compartments in our living grounds, the place we live. But sometimes we think that it's going to be useless because our neighbors are not doing their job. I mean, if we don't all fight dengue mosquitoes, even if one person individually does, well, that's not going to solve the problem. Mosquitoes will be coming back because the neighborhood is not taking that responsibility collectively, right? So we also discussed the social aspects of choices and behavior. And it's good to get back to those concepts before we look at this film, right? We're going to use those concepts to understand what's going on here, what can we do, and what we, at this point, are not able to achieve when we design and implement public policy. Okay? All right, so let's have a look back at this film. So, Daniel Blake. As I said before, this is a British citizen and he's having a hard time. I mean, it's a period in life. He's a lonely guy. I mean, he lives by himself. He's lost his wife some time ago. We don't know exactly when. And he's had a heart attack, right? So he was forced to retire, but he's in that transition from someone who had a very extreme health problem, and he's not yet completely retired. He's trying to get his benefit from the social system, right? From the government's plans to support people, right? So he's in this transition. He comes from a sector in which he has most likely low pay, not enough money, and he basically used some old technology to deal with woodwork and things like this, right? Carpentry and things like this. All right, so as the film goes on, we observe that this guy, he has a relatively reasonable community relations. I mean, he has support, he knows people, people support him. He's not a completely isolated person. He has apparently good relations with some of his neighbors, and he kind of helps them out, gets help back, and things uh, are not that extreme from that perspective, right? We observe community solidarity. We see that people have donations, food banks to help people in in hunger, and so we see that there is this social structure that somehow tries to support people having a hard time in their lives, right? But the main focus of this film is about social benefit and public services in general, right? So the 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 main situation, the main problem here is that there is this guy who's trying to do the right thing. I mean, he's trying to access his rights and he can't. And there are many reasons for that. One of those is that we have private companies which are hired by the state, by the government, to provide public services. What's the matter with that? Well, supposedly, Sometimes when you have public servants trying to provide those services, many times they are not that effective. Many times we don't get to deliver good services uh, with a reasonable low costs. So there is this attempt from governments and state in general trying to provide services efficiently, right? So they hire a private company to provide those services in the name of the state, right? So then you have, for example, the phone call on holding for hours, right? When you and I, when we try to call a phone company to cancel a service or something, sometimes we have to wait for hours on the phone before we get to talk to someone, right? So uh, this respectful way of attending people, it is present there too. We have confusing and sometimes imprecise registry. We have poor case management, which means uh, when you present a claim or somehow we contact this service provider to demand some sort of correction or services, we see that their registry, the amount of information they already have on you, it's very imprecise. It's sometimes not available. So we have lots and lots of mismatch and delay in trying to access services, right? What we call here in Brazil burocracia, the expression in English is red tape. It's like people have not thought about it, how to solve it, how to design that services in a better and more functional way. So we have this intersection of poorly provided services and digital transformation. It's all through computers, but this is an old guy and he doesn't have the computer skills to access a website, to print the form, to fill it out, or to submit it online. So we are dealing here with some sort of change in the way government does stuff, either in this uh, poorly planned digital transformation or with the private provision of a public service. But things don't work. And accessing benefits, accessing people's rights is getting harder and harder, right? So rules are very strict and they are not built to help people. So what we have here is like lots and lots of obstacles so that people can't access their rights. And we have a name for this thing. It's the opposite of nudge. If you have good memory, you know that I'm talking about sludge, right? That's the expression we used before. So we have obstacles rather than nudges, rather than somehow trying to help people to make better decisions and to get most of their decisions, right? We also observe that families hit by financial crisis, apparently they enter a spiral of hardship. And we can see that from this family, friends of Daniel Blake, and they try to help each other, but things are getting tougher. People don't have access to electric services in their own home, so they tend to get sick. So we observe that this is like a spiral of hardship, of problems that accumulate and become more extreme, and it turns out that people are going through into towards collapse, right? People's lives are going towards a collapse, and we can see that as a process, and there's very few ways to stop it. It's almost like we know what's going to happen because it's almost inevitable that people will get harder and harder problems, and sometimes will die because of all those problems, right? They briefly discuss the impacts of international trade and China, how that affect working conditions for poor families and low pay, even in developed countries, right? So this is also mentioned somehow and presented in the film. And at the end, as almost an inevitable consequence, Blake dies at the end from a second heart attack, and that happened right before getting his case considered by a judge, right? It looked like he was almost succeeding and surpassing all those difficulties but right before uh, he accesses his rights, his benefits, it turns out that he passes away, right? So it's a sad end of a predictable uh, disaster, right? Something that we expect throughout the film. But what this film brings us is that um, we don't have good ways to so far to reform public policy so far that we can actually attend to people. So we are led to observe better how the government goes about to deliver social services, public services, and unfortunately, there are very few cases of successes. But then, well, that's not what we have discussed so far. I mean, we have also discussed how these services have been improved over the next 10 or 15 years. We talked about how behavior economics is called for help, right? I mean, how we can use behavior economics to try and address those issues. We have discussed the mind space methodology, which, by the way, is British, and it has had huge influence in public services in general in the Great Britain, right? And people have discussed there, they are using this, and it's an ongoing revolution. But we still have lots of steps to climb on before we get all the results, right? So just to remind you a little bit, mind space, for example, we observe that people are heavily influenced by who communicates information. Just information, just a message, that's not enough. Many times, if the message is delivered by one person or one celebrity, it will have a completely different impact than if it were submitted by someone else, right? There are incentives. We still are economic individuals, economic agencies. We make calculations, we observe gains, and we observe losses before we make decisions. But there are lots and lots of other aspects of our decision making. We are strongly influenced by what others do. Um, our emotions somehow get associated with some decisions, some choices. Ego is at place many times. We act in ways that make us feel better about ourselves and things like that, right? So all of that should be taken into consideration when you try to design the processes of public services, right? So this is we are observing here a bad case of configuration of how services are designed as we watch the film Daniel Blake. But we have all these tools that we could have used in order to prevent the tragedy at the end of the film, right? But then again, we also want to bring back the concept of social learning. And then let's try and think a little bit about poverty, not only from the perspective of a developed country. Let's think about poverty in Brazil. as we started this session, right? Let's remember the Brazilian favela, the communities in Brazil with hundreds of thousands of people, right? We have poor communities with hundreds of thousands of people. That, I mean, it's huge. It's the size of cities all over the world. And we have these people not only uh, in very low paid jobs or occupations, and sometimes they don't access income at all. They have to depend on someone else's help. And sometimes we have to stop and think what people learn in those conditions. Not only uh, why people don't learn, right? Many times we say, oh yeah, people don't learn because they don't have good schools. They don't access, I don't know, transportation. That's why they can't go to school, and therefore they can get, oh, maybe people are not eating well. I mean, they are poorly nourished and they have hunger, and it's hard to learn if you are in such and such conditions. But aside from this question, why people don't learn, why they don't get better skills and therefore better jobs, better income, we have to ask what people learn from poverty. What does poverty, which impacts poverty may have on people's self-efficacy, which means how people believe in their own capacity to solve problems. What are the impacts of poverty in social or collective efficacy? The belief that we as a community could solve those problems, right? So what I'm trying to say here, or I'm trying to uh, bring to mind with these questions, is that sometimes people learn how to behave poorly in poverty. And this is like a hard lesson. It's not something that you wish to learn, but you end up learning from very, very, very difficult conditions. So you learn that you shouldn't try. You learn that if you do try, you're going to be alone and it's going to be useless. Those are very, very hard lessons and they're painful. So we teach people that they are not able, that they are not going to be uh, successful. And that's something that we have to think, right? I mean, if you really want to address poverty, exclusion, and uh, dependence, we have to understand what's going on people's mind and how poverty as a social condition will teach people those very, very extreme and hard lessons. On the other hand, we are on the 21st century. We have to think anew. We have to try new stuff. We have to innovate in order to try and fix this situation, right? So the best messages we have regarding that is first trying to understand that poverty can blunt the capacity to aspire, to take advantage of opportunities which sometimes will present themselves, right? So people have to have trust in their own capacity. And that's a hard thing to do. I mean, if you give people hope in some contexts, you may end up destroying their lives. I mean, it's paradoxical, right? I mean, hope in a very hard situation may end up having destructive consequences. So what can you do in order to uh, uh, hope and help, right? We have to give hope and we have to give help at the same time, so that people will trust themselves, they will reach for solutions, and they will become more uh, trusting on themselves, right? So that's the big challenge. And then there are three promising ways to ensure that poor people have adequate cognitive space to make the best decisions. Let me be more specific about this thing here. Um, I think I have mentioned in class before that uh, we have a kind of, we look at poor people with some sort of prejudice or a preconception that they make poor decisions, right? If you are not poor, you haven't been poor in your whole life, well, it's likely that you're going to look at people in poverty and say, yeah, they make bad decisions. But that's not exactly true. I mean, if you take even you, an educated person, someone that is going to college, has had a sort of a luck compared to many, many other Brazilians, uh, if you take someone as you or me, and if you submit these people, you, me, to the same conditions, the same stressful situations that poor people, in which poor people live their lives, it's very likely that we are going to make as poor choices as they do. So, I mean, we have experiments showing that if you raise the level of stress and if you uh, submit the decision maker to a context which looks like what you're seeing there in that picture, regardless of how educated, how many years of school learning people have had, they will make as poor choices as happen all the time, right? So how we try to improve that? There are three ways. The first one, simplify procedures. That's the opposite of I, Daniel Blake, right? The film I, Daniel Blake, things are really tough. You have to go online, you have to print the forms. Once you submit the forms, you have to wait for a call. You're talking on the phone with the person, and that person on the phone tells you, oh, you have to wait for a call. Come on, you're talking to me right now. Why do I have to wait to some other people calling me? Oh, yeah, that's the way it is. So we have to try and simplify procedures. There are some fantastic ways to do that. We know that digital transformation sometimes help, but as we are shown in the film, we have to be aware that not everybody is digitally capable. I mean, not all of us have born with a thing like that in our pockets. So we have to be careful, otherwise we may end up excluding people as we are trying to help them, right? Rather than helping them, we are preventing them from accessing their rights, right? So this is the first thing, first lesson, simplify procedures. The second one, we have to target assistance on the basis of bandwidth. Now let me explain a little bit more about this idea. Bandwidth, largura de banda, what are you talking about? What we're talking about here is attention. We have to come with the message in in an opportune moment. If people are too stressed, let's say, for example, a mother is just about to give birth to her child, right? So that's a stressful moment in her life. Many choices that she has to make at that moment, well, may she may not be at the same at the best mind. I mean, her mind might not be as clear to make that choice at that moment. So in those moments, we may have to help people to make good choices. or we have to bring choices that are important to mothers away, bring them away beforehand the moment of birth, right? Or maybe a little bit after birth. So we have to plan the moment in which we are going to come up with solutions and present some sort of assistance. But we have to understand that people's attention, they are not all the time available. So we have to think about what is convenient, what is opportune to be presented to people, right? So that is planning. That means thinking ahead how I may reach people and do so in the best moment, right? And the third thing is we have to try and reduce income volatility and improve infrastructure. Otherwise, all that the government does may end up being useless. So if people don't have money enough to at least purchase food, it doesn't matter how perfect the school is. If people are not eating well, the school will not, even if the school is very well maintained, good professors, all of that, it's not going to be enough. I mean, you're going to waste your money on education if people are not eating well, right? So we have somehow to provide this most fundamental infrastructure. It has to be there. Otherwise, uh, your other efforts will be useless, right? So some of the things we already knew, and some of them we're learning as we go. But to learn that, we have to think that public policy has to work in cycles. So we define the problem and we try to diagnose it. I mean, to evaluate it from a very, very careful, precise perspective. And then we will design intervention, try and implement programs, sometimes pilots, and then we're going to learn from our experience. We're going to adapt it, redefine, re-diagnose. So public policy should learn from itself in cycles. Many times, what prevents public policy from working in Brazil is the fact that we don't want to learn from our mistakes. We don't evaluate programs correctly, carefully, and that may be due to the fact that we consider evaluation somehow part of punishment. We see that if we evaluate something, is that someone is to blame. We don't see evaluation as a process of building up capacity, of planning better, and delivering better services. When we think the word evaluation, avaliação in Portuguese, we mostly think about is punishment. And then we don't learn. We don't avoid mistakes, predictable mistakes, many times when we are trying to we're trying to deliver good public services, right? We also should remember that in Brazil, most of the priorities in public services are provided by municipalities, the city management. And we know that from a management perspective, cities, the mayors, the small cities, sometimes they don't have good management. Sometimes they don't have skillful professionals to implement sophisticated policies. So people do whatever they can and they say, yeah, if it works, great. If it doesn't, well, that's how it works. We try our best, and so we waste lots and lots of money in attempts to do things less professionally than we could do, right? All right, let's have a look at some good examples here. So we keep not only talking about poor uh, poor choices and unfortunate cases, right? So let's take a look at this water chlorination efforts, right? So what we are dealing here is the quality of water. Sometimes we have to treat water before giving it to people so that people will drink, right? We know that in Brazil, the majority of people don't get water from a standard or treated way. They get water from rain, they get raw water from rivers, and sometimes they have their own wells in a community from which they draw water, and that's mostly uh, irregular, unofficially established wells, and there you go. We have poor quality of water. So people get sick very often from drinking water without treatment, right? So how we deal with that? And not only in Brazil, I mean all over the world. So here's an example of Madagascar, which is obviously a developing country, and we observe that uh, problems, obstacles to good quality, to good water quality, have to be dealt with from specific perspectives, right? So let's take a look at potential obstacles and what are the solutions. First one, people do not understand how to use chlorine. Oh yeah, well, people were afraid those chemicals, they may kill you or whatever. So we have to give them detailed instructions. Notice that this first line there, it's like the conventional way of delivering policy. We say, the problem is information. If you give people information, the problem is gone. But wait, what we have discussed over the last 13 weeks is that information is not enough, right? We have to go further. We have to take another step and try to understand, even with good information, people may not act in their own benefit, right? So let's have a look at some other obstacles here. Procrastination may cause individuals to postpone visits to the store where the chlorine is sold. So you say, yeah, I have to treat water, but I don't have time this week. I will try next week. Oh, yeah, it's July already. I'm going to try in August. No, I'm going to try by the end of the year. And then we keep postponing, right? So procrastination, how we uh, prevent procrastination from being one more obstacle to water treatment. So we deliver bottles freely at home. I mean, if you have the resources, that could be a solution. We can also have chlorine dispensers at point of collection. As people go to get water, they also have the opportunity to take chlorine, sometimes with detailed instructions. This is the intelligent way of trying to put things together to move public policy towards a moment where decision is made, right? To the moment where decision is made. And then you try to reach people when they are somehow ready to make good decisions, right? Uh, Third obstacle here, people were not motivated to use chlorine because the effect on health is delayed. So you don't see immediately the consequences of drinking poorly treated water. And you only observe the benefits after 2, 3, 4 months, maybe a year, 2 years later. So it's hard to make choices now about something that will only benefit you 6 months from now, 1 year from now. So how you deal with this problem? Well, you use persuasion messages. Notice here, uh, you have to be ethical, you have to try and help people, but sometimes you may say, you know what, this problem is so dangerous, it's so grave that you have to make a stronger message here, or stronger persuasion uh, mechanism here, uh, because you are concerned about people's lives, right? It's the matter of dying or living, right? So what we see in this diagram is that you don't have a single silver bullet to deal with the problem. You have to try different perspectives. You have to understand all the potential obstacles that prevent people from acquiring some behavior, some desirable behavior. And then you have to address them individually, how you can fix that specific problem, right? So this is how we try and learn. This is why you have to implement some policy, observe its results before you try something else, before you add some other features to your intervention, right? I wanted to say a few more words about attention, what we called here bandwidth, right? How people should get help in opportune ways, right? So if you are busy, if you are in an extreme position, if you are trying to make a living out of a pandemic, you don't have income, I mean, you don't have a job, it's hard to even to make sure that your family has enough to eat. So if I talk to people about health care in that moment, I mean, they will may even think that this is disrespectful. They'll say, come on, you're talking about fitness, you're talking about sleeping well, but we don't eat, we don't have enough food. So let's deal with this thing first. Uh, then again, we have to understand that people's minds are not always open for your messages. You have to find the right moment and the right way to approach them and somehow to share solutions in ways that they may actually observe them. They will actually realize that those are actually solutions, right? And there are two ways to do that. You can either move decisions to different moments, or you can target assistance to the time of decision. So the example that we had with chlorine and water treatment, well, let's suppose that people come to a specific well to get water. You should provide instructions and chlorine at that moment. So as they get water, they will take also the solution to poorly treated water, right? That's a hard thing to do, but that's the result of planning. And I have also to say that if we don't do these things, we may end up having whole generations suffering and getting somehow frustrated by poorly developed personal skills. And what I'm trying to say here is that um, there is this sort of path dependence in which if people do not have enough food and they do not have a healthy environment to grow on from their very first years of lives, they may end up having limited capacity to develop later on. And those are the results of eye-opening research results. We have observed those and have got those knowledges very recently. But let's have a look at here how neurons develop themselves through the first 3 years of lives. So in the first diagram here, typical neurons. If people have lived in normal situations, they have grown up the first 2 3 years in stable homes with enough food, with minimum quality of sleep, they will they will develop neurons in a healthy way. And that's what you see here on the left-hand side. If you have the right-hand side, the underdeveloped connections in your brain, those may be the effect of toxic stress. I mean, stressful conditions from the very beginning of life. The first few years of life, you have kids submitted to hardships and eating poorly and surviving domestic violence. All of that toxic environment may prevent people's brain from developing normally. And this is astonishing. I mean, this is absolutely eye-opening. We have to stop for a while and check what are the priorities in public services, right? I mean, if you have kids underdeveloped mentally, well, you're going to have lots and lots of problems later on. I mean, you may have a population whose capacity is limited by those very first years of lives. So this is choosing priorities in public policy. And this is an important message as science uh, studies those effects. We observe that this thing is part of inequality. When you observe income inequality in a society, mostly you think that that is essentially due to the fact that people have different access to education, right? Uh, Rich kids have better schools than poor kids, therefore they will develop faster. I mean, they will get more skills and they will get the jobs. But what we are trying to say here is that that inequality may be planted on very, very earlier. I mean, from the first 2 or 3 years of lives, considering the brain development of children, you may already have inequality. So what you see here is that different capacities, mental capacities, may be more or less developed depending if you are talking about a kid in a rich family or a poor family, right? So what you have here is in red is like the poorest in society, and in light blue you have the wealthiest in society. And you can see that one, two, three, four, five, six mental capacities. In all cases, you see this progression. As kids have more, come from wealthier families, they develop much, much, much better skills, either vocabulary ones, working memory, visual spatial processing, fluid reasoning, all capacities in the way the brain works, they are delivered, they are developed uh, in wealthiest families, but not in poorest ones. So this is the completely um, terrible evidence that we have. I mean, this is we look at this and we say that is as unfair as it gets, right? I mean, how can we talk about merit and competition in a society in which this evidence is available? How can we have a discourse or somehow to reason our way out of public policy if we know that poor people and poor kids are prevented from mental development over the first 3 years of age? I mean, there's no competition, there's no merit-based society in those conditions, right? So we have to be honest about this. This is as unfair, as unequal as it gets when uh, kids are prevented from development. So we have to think our priorities straight, right? We have to think about this in a more fundamental way. And I would like to finish this uh, remembering all of us that this subject has been one that has been appreciated by the Nobel Prize in Economics. So James Heckman, this is an economist who won the Nobel Prize, and one of the most important researchers that this guy has done is basically essentially about how early childhood development of mental skills, how they will create a very specific path in their careers, in their lives in general. And it's not like if you come from a poor family, you are doomed. It's not like that. But what he actually shows, studying lots and lots of data, is that if you come from a poor family, it is very likely that you will be limited in your uh, development, even though you can access a good life, even though you can surpass, you can overcome poverty, you can have success in life. Yes, it is possible, but uh, it is unlikely from the very beginning. And I mean, if you manage to gather enough data, you can show that in any society in the world. That I mean, we are actually having like a unfair system from the very beginning, and that's what we call path dependence. You're not gonna open a second door if you haven't opened the first one. You are only will have access to the third door if you have opened the first door and opened the second door. You cannot circumvent your way in order to access better opportunities. You're going to have to go through it. So, um, if, once you understand path dependence in people development and in society development, you have to deal with the problem of early childhood skill development and interventions, right? All right, guys, I'm going to stop here. Uh, this, in my opinion, is one of the most important topics we have discussed so far. So I hope you guys watch this video, and we're going to have some discussions in class next time. Okay? Thanks for watching. Please write down your questions. If you don't understand something, you want me to help you out, please remember to ask them, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.